Good day, everybody. So, we were off last week, so there hasn't been a video in about 2 weeks now. Nevertheless, though, we are going to continue on. We're working through book 6 today. If you can't tell, I did update some things in my background, so don't be surprised if you see more. Got some free stuff at a conference last week and bought a couple of small things to decorate the place up a little bit. So, looks a little different behind me, but hopefully it looks better and a little bit less bare, especially on the walls, as I like it. But nevertheless, we're going to get back into the narrative here. Remember, in book 5, Raphael began recounting the story of the rebellion of Lucifer and the angels which followed him, now the demons in hell. But in the story, they began their rebellion against God. They had their council. The warfare hadn't begun yet, but if we remember, Abdiel exhibits the virtue of courage, standing firm against them in opposition, and him and Satan have a back and forth, and that's where we leave off in book 5. So here, Raphael is going to continue the story on to Adam. We're going to get a lot of warfare here, but we're also going to get other things as well. So there's a sense here where the warfare here is going to be epic poetry, really, in some of its most genuinely epic forms. As we get this martial prowess, we get these battle sequences, these dialogues that take place within the battles, which should remind you very, very much so of the Iliad, undoubtedly where Milton was probably the most influenced, certainly in Book 6, and as I've kind of asserted before, where I believe Homer influenced Milton more than any of the other great epic poets. Maybe Homer influenced him more than anything else besides the Bible, and maybe even Augustine in a sense. But nevertheless, we're going to get kind of a transition piece here. This has already kind of begun in Book 5, but um, remember, we have the focus is really on Satan in the first 3 books, and then the focus is really on Adam and Eve a lot and Satan's kind of commentary on their lives in book 4. Whereas book 5, Raphael comes in and he kind of asserts this, really kind of asserts this theme of kind of setting us up for hope, whereas despair is going to come in the narrative. So we are ultimately going to get the exaltation of Christ. We're going to see that asserted forward, and even some foreshadowing here that though despair is coming and the fall is coming, ultimately there is hope in Christ in an eschatological sense that goes downward all the way across the narrative, past the fall, past the church age, and into eternity, where those who have faith in Christ do have hope, unlike the fallen angels and unlike those who do not have faith in Christ. So, just confirming too that we are in the media res here. We're in the middle of the action and the plot. We're not at the beginning. The book begins in that way. We're still really in that in a sense. And so we're going to get this battle in heaven. It's going to really reach up to the beginning of time, maybe even before the beginning of time, technically, and extends through eternity and into that, beyond that, redemptive historical narrative, which we get in Scripture and the Church Age. So book 5, we leave off with Abdiel, like I said earlier, and thankfully we get much more of Abdiel here in book 6. He's our paragon of fortitude, of courage in this poem. Um, Perhaps exemplifies that better than anybody, better than almost any character in really all of literary history, as I can certainly think of it right now. But whenever Abdiel speaks, we want to really hone in on think of how he's an exemplar for us. Not even when he speaks, but as Milton describes him through Raphael telling the story to Adam in Frame. We want to think about the virtue ethics being communicated to us, with Abdiel being the character that we study. So when we study literature, we should want to think of the implications of virtue and vice, of sin and obedience. Those things all contrasted, of course, with one another. And what we can glean from that as Christians. I think even a non Christian could see how they could learn more about courage in their own life from Abdiel, but it's particularly relevant to Christians, standing firm in faith amidst temptation to sin and others rejecting God, which is exactly what Abdiel represents for us. So like I said too, we get battle scenes. We're going to get these back and forths. We're going to get a lot of Homeric influence. We'll get into those more later. But one thing I noticed here, and this is in line 175, we get this line. It's in the original 1674 text, which is actually the second and final revision of Paradise Lost. There was another one in the late 1660s, was the original technically. But here we get these lines, and I'm going to read lines 175 to 188 here. Unjustly thou depravest it with the name of servitude, to serve whom God ordains, or nature. God and nature bid the same when he who rules is worthiest, and excels them whom he governs. This is servitude. To serve the unwise, or him who hath rebelled against his worthier, as thine now serve thee, thyself not free, but to thyself enthralled. Yet lewdly darest our ministering upbraid. Reign thou in hell, thy kingdom. Let me serve in heaven God ever blessed, and his divine behest obey, worthiest to be obeyed. So this is Abdiel replying to Satan at the beginning of the poem, and servitude, like I said, is italicized in the original text. It's not going to be in your versions, that's kind of why I'm pointing it out here, but italicizing a word is putting a lot of emphasis on it, right? Like sometimes in certain like publications or writings we italicize something just because it's showing that that's like a text, like a title. But here, he's emphasizing the word servitude here. And what he's really doing here is defining for us what this means, where Satan is himself is he's a servus, that's the Latin word for slave. Whereas you see this in the Greek New Testament, where in the Greek, doulos is the word for slave. And Abdiel is essentially calling him a slave because he's in opposition and rebellion to the good. He's a slave to sin. He's a slave to his own rebellion. He's a slave to vice. And the best way of living, the virtuous way of living, is to live in submission to God, and knowing one's place in the hierarchy of being, accepting, being content where God has placed one, and again, living in obedience and contentment to that, not envying others who are higher than you, not envying their station, but accepting that. But Abdiel is calling out Satan, knowing that Satan cannot accept his place, and that makes Satan a servus. It makes him a slave at the end of the day. And so, just connotation there for just a classical background here too. Being a slave can actually be a positive thing in a sense. So kind of the word itself can be neutral, just taken at face value. But being a slave can be a good thing, where sometimes the servus was just like an indentured servant. They lived in the slave quarters in the Roman villa, which is the basically just a large Roman estate. It's where like wealthy Roman people would have lived. The dominum was the master, and they had servi, the plural version of slave. So they had slaves who worked full time, taking care of the land, taking care of the household chores in the villa, and taking care of the liberi, or the children of the dominum. And so, in conversation of classical philosophy, it's really about somebody is a servus in classical philosophy because they are a slave to vice. They're a slave to passion. They're not well-ordered. They're not self-governed. They're not temperate. They're not prudent. They follow their passions blindly, right? They're, in a sense, they're unable to govern themselves with reason, the head, and so the belly, their appetites, this is reference to C.S. Lewis' Abolition of Man, they only live by the appetites. They're slaves to just the fleeting pleasures, right? That's how it would have been understood in classical philosophy. And this is in contrast to the vir liberalis, which is the liberal man. That's what we talk about when we talk about liberal arts education. It's an education that makes us free because education brings us into the truth. It draws us into the great ideas and great ethics of history and how to live well, how to be happy, as Aristotle called eudaimonia, happiness being a very different thing as our 21st century culture would define it as today. But this is all in context to what Abdiel is calling Satan here. He's a slave to vice, he's a slave to passion, and that's what he's pointing out to us here. So important to understand that context here. Also, just noting that by this point in his life, Milton had written about liberty for well over 20 years. His 1644 text, Areopagitica, which mainly had to do with freedom of the press, freedom of publishing in his time. But he wrote about freedom a lot, and of course his views on free will certainly had ties in with his view on just personal liberty as well, and liberty of conscience. So just noting that as well, that there's a sense where, for Milton, obedience to God is freedom. Satan is not obedient to God. He's in complete rebellion to him, and therefore it makes him a slave. That's really what's being voiced through the character of Abdiel here, is sort of a mouthpiece for Milton's ideas, I believe. Then, just another interesting thing we hear, I'm going to talk about an object in the poem specifically here for a little bit, but we get a description starting at around line 250 of Michael's sword, and we get another one around line 320. And around 250, so we get these descriptions that it requires two hands to wield. So it's a two-handed sword, meaning basically nobody's strong enough to wield it with one hand. And so it's something like a great sword, which in ancient and medieval times that would have typically been 5 feet in length, usually as like the minimum, and more upwards of 7 feet, maybe even a little more than 7 feet at its largest. So you might think of something as like a claymore in Scotland was about 7 feet, or the Zweihander in Germany was about a little over 7 feet as well. These were great swords. They had to be wielded with two hands, and you probably had to almost swing them overhand like a hammer in a sense, or a giant hammer, a giant blunt weapon. They were kind of like that, except they were sharp because they were still swords. We kind of get these descriptions here, but honing in on one specific word here, and I'm going to try not to get too into this, but some just classical allusions that I like to throw out here. It refers to the word adamant being made of adamant material here, and that was known to be the hardest substance in existence. So basically it was kind of like this old form of diamond, derived from the Greek word adamas, which usually meant something like indestructible, invincible, unbreakable, unbeatable. So it's known to be just the hardest, most unbreakable substance that there is, and that's what the sword is being described as. And this alludes to a long classical tradition of using this, describing things being made of this material. I'm going to name a few just to kind of help fill in the gaps of education there, and so I'll go through a couple of those right here in a second. So first, the leader of the Titans, Cronus, used an adamantine sickle to castrate his father Uranus, and Perseus also used this same the same type of weapon, I don't know if they were the same exact weapon or not, to behead Medusa. She's one of the Gorgons, and we know her as the lady with snakes in her hair, typically in pop culture. In the play Prometheus Bound by the great dramatist Aeschylus, Hephaestus, that's the Greek god of the forge, also King Vulcan in the Roman, same guy basically. He imprisons Prometheus in adamantine chains as his punishment for stealing the flame from the gods. Zeus orders him to do that, and these chains have a connotation where Prometheus will never be freed from that because there's no way he's breaking out of those chains. In the Aeneid, Tartarus has pillars of solid adamant. In the 1620 Holy Sonnet 1, the great English poet who was writing a little bit before Milton's lifetime, and even in Milton's lifetime, 1620 being when Milton was an adolescent, John Donne states that God draws John Donne's iron heart by force that is like adamant. So God's force is adamant. It's showing us as a simile that God's power and love is unconquerable, unrelenting. It is unable to be stopped in a sense, and that John Donne's heart, being like iron, is moved by God's adamantine love. Just another English connotation there. I'd be really shocked if Milton didn't read that sonnet before, but he's probably read all of these things, right? There are actually 8 uses of this term in Paradise Lost as well, which would not be surprising at all given Milton's educational background. We're actually going to get this same term again at line 542 of Book 6 when Zophiel is speaking. After Milton, this was also being used by people who were connected with the classical tradition. So, in the Enlightenment, the author Jonathan Swift, most famous for his work Gulliver's Travels, was really pushing back and doing a lot of satire against the hyper-rationalist scientific ideals of the Enlightenment. And in Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, where Laputa is basically a floating island that represents the scientific-minded rationalists who don't basically unhitch ethics from science, and they're the Jurassic Park. They do things without questioning whether or not they should. They represent that in Gulliver's Travels, and their base is made of adamant, the hard substance. So there's a tradition that comes after Milton as well. We even see those references with like the Crown of Gondor in Lord of the Rings with Tolkien. So that has really specific connotations. I'm sorry if I'm getting too into the weeds with it here, but I think it's interesting, and I think these connections are important to make. So I'm going to leave you with all of those for now. Be looking out for that word in Milton, because like I said, it's going to come again, and I believe it'll come at least 1 or 2 more times, if not more, in books 7 through 12, the second half of this poem. So the sword itself, too, at line 320-ish, we get a description that's neither keen nor solid might resist that edge. So there's a sense where, again, nothing can resist Michael's sword. It is the most powerful, sharpest sword that it can possibly be, in a sense. And perhaps we could even argue here that Milton outdoes Virgil here, who he gives us a description similar of Turnus's sword, merely shattering on impact of Aeneas's armor. So whereas Turnus's sword, this is in the climax of the Aeneid, Book 12, Turnus's sword breaks on Aeneas's armor, but Michael's sword does not break on anything. It is, in a sense, all-powerful, or as powerful as a sword can be, and we see that coming out in the warfare here. Anyway, enough nerding out about Michael's sword, though I could do more. I will digress, or will not digress further, I should say, and move on to another idea here, which we see at lines, I'm going to introduce this at lines 296 to 303, as I will read right now. They ended parley, and both addressed for fight unspeakable. For who, though with the tongue of angels, can relate, or to what things liken on earth conspicuous, that may lift human imagination to such height of godlike power? For likest gods they seemed, stood they or moved, in stature, motion, arms, fit to decide the empire of great heaven. So we get this sense of incomprehensibility here, where Raphael is relating to Adam and Eve, probably in the best way he possibly can relate it to a human, but we can only imagine this warfare so much, right? I talked about the connections to the Iliad and Homer, but the fights in the Iliad are going to be much more grounded and comprehensible to us as humans, because other than the gods interfering with the battle in the Iliad, which they certainly do quite a bit, when we see Ajax or Hector or Achilles or Patroclus or other figures in the Iliad fighting, they're humans just like we are, though, you know, Achilles is obviously a demigod in a sense. This is still much more comprehensible and able to be understood, whereas here, there's going to be a sense where Adam and Eve and us also as humans can only understand so much about the war with angels. So just as this is described, be keeping that in the back of your mind as how much can we actually imagine here. It's kind of like reading Dante, where, especially in Paradiso, there's things where he tries to relate to us, but we just can't get them. We can't grasp them with the mind. They're too far out there to be reached in a way. So just keep that in mind in a sense here. And this is even different than the battle between Kronos and the Titans in Greek mythology, where though they are celestial beings like the angels and the demons, for Milton more like the demons, um, this is ultimately in the Christian epic, like Paradise Lost, this is all grounded in the transcendence of God, which is totally different than battling on Olympus, which is it's not a transcendent world. Whereas the heavens are they're different than Olympus, right? Like we can't compare the two in a way because one is part of created order and one is not. And so just there's going to be an element of incomprehensibility here, and we need to keep that in mind as we proceed through these texts, and really book 6 specifically. But after a lot of descriptions of battle and some back and forth, almost like some smack talk like speak between Abdiel and Satan, and then others chime in as well. We finally get beyond the battle sequences, and Satan is going to be speaking of his defeat here. So he says, this is starting at line 424. He says, "And if one day, why not eternal days? What heaven's Lord had powerfulest to send against us from about his throne, and judged sufficient to subdue us to his will, but proves not so, then, fallible, it seems, of future we may deem him, though till now, omniscient thought. True is, less firmly armed, some disadvantage we endured, in pain till now not known, but known as soon contemned, since now we find this our imperial form, incapable of mortal injury, imperishable, and though pierced with wound, soon closing, and by native vigor healed." So here we get in the first part of these lines, Satan is completely missing the point here, right? Like he's thinking that in some way that he is like it's somehow on his own power and his own merits, his own nature that he is not being completely destroyed here. But he misses the point that God could completely destroy him. For whatever God's reasons be, in his providence, Satan and his demons were not completely destroyed, though God certainly had the power here. But we get a bit of Satan's logic here as well, where he's saying God has set his full power through the angels against them, and they survived, and God has judged the good angels sufficiently to stand up to his forces. Therefore, God is fallible, and he's not omniscient, maybe even not omnipotent in a way, all-knowing being omniscient, and omnipotent being all-powerful. But Satan doesn't understand this, right? So God did not send his full force against him. He could have just destroyed them at, the equivalence of a snap of a finger, but he engaged in warfare for some reason, and Satan doesn't even, whether he knows that, he's certainly not acknowledging it, he's denying it, and Satan's motives are not always clear, but that's something we have to look at here. Whereas, we contrast that with what's going to come later with Nizrak, who's going to chime in here as well, and he's in Book 6, he's kind of like Malak in Book 2, in the beginning of Book 2, who really has this more nonchalant and chill approach, maybe more realistic in some ways, because they're acknowledging that they can't defeat God. They have their problems and their own views and arguments, but they're more realistic, and at least in some ways, than Satan because of that. And Nizrak basically is going to echo, or Malak is going to echo Nizrak in a sense here by saying that God has the power to completely destroy them, and they're going to take that in certain directions, of course. But kind of transitioning there smoothly a little bit to Nizrak in Book 6, who again in some ways is much more honest than Satan. In the Renaissance dictionary made by C. Stephanus, who Milton would have read, Nizrak meant flight, or it also meant vexilium delictum, which means delicate temptation. And so this is telling us something about Nizrak, that perhaps he's a bit timid in his approach. Maybe whereas Satan is not courageous because he's reckless and he's foolish in his own ways of being in denial of the truth. Nisroch perhaps knows the truth and maybe is exhibiting cowardice in some sense. That can all be debated, but I want to throw these ideas at you right now so that you can think about them and perhaps they will merit discussion on Wednesday night here when we discuss this book. But Nisroch there is a biblical sense to this. So in 2 Kings 19:37, we're told that Nisroch is a god of the Assyrian people. He's an idol where Sennacherib is worshiping in the temple, and his sons come to murder him. So remember that Milton is always using false gods. A lot of times he's pulling from the Old Testament text here to show that false gods are invoked in the Old Testament, which they are, and that they ultimately betray their worshippers. And that's a huge motif in the Old Testament, right? Where people worship false gods, they think that it's going to somehow save them, and then God shows his own might and glory and power against the false gods, where they completely fail. One of the most obvious examples being like that of Baal, where they're praying to the altar of Baal, and Baal can't light the fire, but God can light the fire for them, for the Israelite people who are faithful to him. So just keep that motif in mind, because Milton is certainly drawing on that a lot in Paradise Lost. And again, Satan here, just as doing what Satan always does, he is in denial and he disregards what Nisroch has to say and counsel him towards. So, line 42 here, he says, "These in their dark nativity, the deep shall yield us pregnant with infernal flame, which into hollow engines, long and round, thick rand, at the other bore with touch of fire, dilated and infuriate, shall send forth, from far with thundering noise among our foes, such implements to mischief as shall dash to pieces and overwhelm whatever stands adverse, that they shall fear we have disarmed the thunder of his only dreaded bolt. Not long shall be our labor yet, ere dawn effect shall end our wish. Meanwhile, revive, abandon fear, to strength and counsel joined, think nothing hard, much less to be despaired." So it's almost like this kind of like Third Reich language here. It's, Nietzschean in some way. And remember, Satan is a proto-Nietzschean. He's that flavor of late modernism and postmodernism for certain here. And there's, of course, influences that Milton Satan has on the 19th and 20th century. But nevertheless, this reminds us of the Third Reich. This reminds us of Morgoth, Sauron, Saruman, the Orcs, Nietzsche, others. Where there's this powerful rhetoric that's brought out to basically show that, like, no, we are powerful enough as humans to exert ourselves. We can will our power here forward, and we can make a better reality than what God and the Christian tradition is giving us, right? We see this all over literature. And Satan's, of course, rejecting any counsel that he can get, and he's trying to assert this here forward. And this is all taking place before the Infernal Council at Pandemonium in Book 2, before Satan's at Eden in Book 4. This is all, we're seeing consistency here in just what kind of character, what kind of tyrant Satan really is here. Of course, not seeing himself as a tyrant, but as a monarch, seeing God as the tyrant, projecting himself onto the monarch, making the monarch the tyrant, as tyrants often do. And so here's a concept that I'm going to apologize now for not introducing epic similes in previous videos. I don't know if I just didn't find one that I wanted to share yet or what, but I probably should have introduced that earlier, so I'm apologizing now for that. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about an epic simile here, because you have to know this. It's in Homer, it's in Virgil, it's in Ovid, it's in Dante. I think it's in Beowulf, if I'm remembering right, maybe in a different way than the Greco-Roman tradition, but you need to know what an epic simile is, and Milton is going to use those, of course, as well, being in that tradition. So, I'm going to read lines 496 to 506 because this is an epic simile, and then I'll really explain what that means afterwards. And this is actually right after the lines I just read, so perfect continuity here. So picking up in 496, he ended, and his words their drooping cheer enlighten, and their languished hope revived. The invention all admired, and each how he, to be the inventor, missed. So easy it seemed, once found, which yet unfound most would have thought impossible. Yet haply of thy race, in future days, if malice should abound, someone intent on mischief inspired, with devilish machination might devise, like instrument to plague the sons of men, for sin on war and mutual slaughter bent. So this is an epic simile, and if you're familiar with what a simile is, you might think, Josh, that was like 11 lines of poetry, like, why did you read them all if that's a simile? Well, the answer is an epic simile, yes, usually includes, in fact, if it doesn't always include, it almost always includes like one line where you see that word as or like, which draws us into a comparison. And we see that at line 505, like instrument to plague the sons of men. There's a simile here, but the epic simile is everything surrounding that simile. So the simile is usually going to be in the middle, maybe even towards the end, like it is here of the text of the passage. But that entire passage is an epic simile, and it takes some practice and work to kind of understand these. That's why I'm introducing it to you now, so you can look out for these in the future. But what it's really going to do is the simile itself draws us into something bigger that's going on in the passage. So again, 505 is our core line there, and instrument, right? Like there's an instrument, it has this instrumental use, like something is being used as a means for something else. That's what an instrument is. But whereas in contrast to instrument, we get the in 499 we get inventor here, and then in 498 we get invention right before that. So I think there's a dual meaning here, actually, with invention, inventor, and what's going to lead up to the rest of the epic simile. But in this first part, we're seeing invention and inventor used to describe Satan and his speech and the effects of his rhetoric, his speechcraft, his oration, if you may, to use another classical term. Oration is basically just a speech. You think of like Cicero and his orations, Quintilius and his orations, famous classical Roman speeches. And this is all tied in with classical rhetoric. In classical rhetoric, we have the 5 canons of rhetoric. This is basically the methodology used to craft a good speech, a good oration. And the first canon of this, canon also, this is coming from the Greek word canon, which means law. Sometimes that was also used as a canon was also just literally a measuring rod sometimes, like almost like a meter stick today. It was a standard, it was a rule, it was a law. And so canons, they're not, that's what it means here. Like canon means law or standard. And so the first standard or canon of rhetoric was inventio, or invention, which was basically just the discovery process. This is a process by which you sit down and you research something and you try to understand what you're going to do to actually write the speech. Canon 2 is arrangement, which is where you begin asking yourself the question of, how will I structure this speech or this piece of writing, and kind of putting that all into place, the structure of your writing. You ever written a paper? Let's take the 5-paragraph essay, for example. Intro, body, 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 conclusion, thesis at the bottom of the intro paragraph, the first paragraph. That's how we arrange an essay, often in English, and of course we build out from the 5-paragraph essay after like 6th or 7th grade usually. But moving on from there, the third canon is styles. This is where you actually write the essay, and these are where you're going to actually make a choice of words, right? This is your wordsmithery, right? How you're going to craft a beautifully written speech takes place in the canon of style. Then, canon 4 is going to be memory, so actually memorizing the text for the purpose of delivering the speech, the presentation. And then Canon 5 is actually delivering it. So Canon 5 is delivery, giving the speech to a live audience. Just some context there, trying to include these classical references as much as I can. But I think there's a sense where they're referring to Satan's rhetoric here with that. But I think the simile is ultimately about bringing evil into Eden and the consequences which shall follow, because Raphael seems to know that there is going to be some sort of catastrophe here, and Michael definitely will relate that in books 11 and 12, where he actually talks about the consequences in the history of the world after the fall. But there's going to be a sense where there's going to be devastation, not just because of the fall directly, not just sin itself entering the world, but because of the effects of sin. There's going to be instruments used to bring atrocities onto humans all throughout human history. There's going to be people using science to dominate those who are less intelligent than them or who have less privilege than them and taking advantage of them. There's going to be people using new inventions in warfare to dominate those who are more primitive than them. We see this with swords and shields and different medieval warfare. We're going to see this with cannons. We're going to see these with gunpowder, especially. I mean, in Milton's time, that being a thing where gunpowder is getting pretty serious. And then eventually we're going to have machine guns coming out in, World War One. Mustard gas, the atomic bomb in World War II. We can just go down the row and think of the atrocities that humans are going to use instrumentally to bring upon one another. And I think that's ultimately what the simile is about here, with that core being like instrument to plague the sons of men. So that's our epic simile there. Think about that more. Please ask questions if that wasn't clear, but that's really what an epic simile is. It's larger text with a line kind of there in the middle with the word as or the word like to really draw us into the actual crux of the simile itself. So moving on from there, we're going to get we're eventually, and I'm skipping some stuff here that we can discuss more in our Wednesday night discussion, but we're going to get back to Raphael relating these things to Adam, and there's a sense where the angels are being tested for the first time, as they have not seen deceit before the warfare in heaven. So they're seeing deceit, rebellion, and warfare for the first time. So it kind of confirms at least one of the reasons why God may have sent Raphael rather than anyone else to Adam, because Raphael has gone through something similar, and maybe he could have sent Abdiel or someone else. That merits good discussion, because I'm not sure why still it was just Raphael. But Raphael can relate to Adam in a way, where he's seen these things take place, and he's going to be able to turn around and take the story and say, Adam, do not do what Satan did. Like, do not rebel against God. It has catastrophic consequences. It's going to destroy Eden, and it's going to be catastrophic to all of your descendants who will come after you and Eve. Do not rebel. That's the entire point of this story, is he's trying to really draw him in to say, be virtuous, be obedient to God, and do not rebel. So the story has a point, right? And Raphael, he's kind of both like a history and a literature teacher, where he's giving him a story, probably more of a history teacher, in that a good classical history teacher would be able to tell history as a story. But he's going to be drawing him in and saying the point is to be virtuous here. Do not be like Satan. Satan is filled with vice, sin, and rebellion. Do not be like him. And he's warning him here, where Satan has a vendetta against God. He wants to get revenge on him. He envies God. He envies God the Son and his place as, being eternally begotten from God, being greater than Lucifer ever could have been. And he's warning him that, Adam, you are caught in the crosshairs between Satan and God. Satan's aiming at God, but because of that, he wants to obliterate you in the process. He wants to destroy humanity in the process. He wants to destroy Eden in the process. And so Raphael is warning him, make the right choice, Adam. I'm warning you, make the right choice. And that's the crux of this, is cultivate the necessary virtue from this tale, from this historical account, so that you do not end up like the human version of Satan. That's it. I think that's his entire point of the the story that he's getting. So that leads us kind of to some closing questions. Of course, there's so much we could have said, and I apologize for not getting more in the conversation. But we as readers know that Adam is going to fail. That's obviously inevitable for even most non-Christians in the Western world know that Adam and Eve fell in Genesis. But I brought this up earlier, but just to remind you, what does this say about Raphael as a teacher? What does it say about the nature of educating and preparing Adam and Eve for Satan in general? And is there any education out there that could have caused them to not fail? I think Milton's asking us these questions. So for Milton, how much of the blame will be on Raphael? And do you agree with Milton? Like, how much would you blame Raphael for them falling? And there's a connection here to the Renaissance tradition where, so obviously Shakespeare was a massive fan of the Italian Renaissance. I mean, he would have read Machiavelli. Those sometimes he uses Machiavellian characters in his plays, but also he was a fan of the poets Petrarch and Boccaccio in 14th century Italy, who were kind of like preludes or precursors to the best of the Italian Renaissance. They were the best poets of their time, generation after Dante. But there's this role in Romeo and Juliet where these star-crossed lovers, they're star-crossed, right? There's some sort of fate or destiny for them to meet each other and to fall in love. But young people in love, and I know this as now being 30, once being 14 and 15 and 18 and 21, and when I didn't really know how to properly order my passions in love, Romeo and Juliet is the same way, where they have these passions. Their attraction to each other perhaps is inevitable, but they need some good counsel, right? Like they're young. They need somebody to give them good advisement and counsel, and unfortunately they don't receive good counsel. Romeo's fellow Montague friends, Benvolio and Mercutio, really don't give him this good counsel, and even Friar Lawrence, who's supposed to be the best counselor in the story, often gives some pretty decent advice. He does urge them to be prudent, but he doesn't always give the greatest advice, and he actually is a complete coward at the end of the play, right? Showing something about him that he's not exactly the greatest mentor in a sense, because he doesn't stand the test of time. And so I'm saying all this to make a connection to Renaissance humanists, as Milton was in the late English Renaissance movement. They were very concerned with the role of offering good counsel to people, especially the young. Kings needed good advisors, right? And the youth needed good advisors to set themselves up well for a good life. So we see here that Raphael's counsel really matters, and I think Milton's intentionally putting that there. So we even see the sense where he cuts Adam off and says, "You're wondering about things that are higher than yourself." Is he right to do that? Did he not tell Adam enough? Or did he tell Adam too much? Should he have cut him off sooner? These are all questions I want you to consider as we draw into further insight in Book 7 and 8, which we're going to get more instruction, and then, of course, the fall in Book 9. So keep these questions in mind. I really, really look forward to discussing these things with you as always, and I will see those of you in my Wednesday night class on Wednesday night, and for those of you who watch this later or don't participate in the class, feel free to reach out anytime. Give me your thoughts in the Google Classroom or just in any other form. I would love to hear them. So thank you so much, and God bless you. Thank you for listening.